So here we are. This is session 5 of our Building on the Foundation. Remember that we took this name from St. Paul, thinking of the church as a building, and that we, whoever we are, whenever we come along in the trajectory of the Christian life, we must lay, there is but one foundation on which we can build, and that is our faithfulness to Christ. So session 5, we've spent a lot of time talking about church space in general. Today, we're going to drill down on cathedrals, a little bit about how we got them, because it is a bit of an anomaly in churches of the Reformation. In fact, it's a huge anomaly. And why they aren't the same as just, a great big church with lots of programs, like a central library or something. So my plan is to give us a break about halfway through, because pictures do make the talking go a bit easier, and there are none. So we'll have a little break about halfway through. I want to address something that came up in the debrief with the facilitators last week, just very briefly, and then launch into today's topics. So first of all, just an introduction to get our heads around the idea of cathedral, a quick and dirty definition of a cathedral, some very messy history, and very potted. I am not an historian, and anybody here like Bill Morrison, who is, I'm asking your forgiveness in advance. I'm going to picture a typical cathedral. I mean, every cathedral is a little bit different, so we're just going to do a blend in our minds and how they grew. Then we'll talk about the relationship between cathedrals and other churches in a diocese, parish churches, then a break. Part 2, just going to let Eleanor in. We'll then move to what actually makes cathedral mission and ministry distinctive. And I have seven brief topics to address. These are they. We live on that kind of teeter-totter between being guardians of tradition and leaders of change. We are, as no other church is, the church for the diocese. There are special considerations for us around worship. We are a place of excellent, or are to be a place of excellent program, including important, meaningful discourse and education. Art and architecture are integral to the offering that cathedrals make to the church and the world. And that includes music, which I will discuss separately. And then finally, the whole question of civic engagement and social justice. So I will try and reiterate those signposts as we go along, but without taking you back to this screen. But just so you, if you're starting to wind your watch in the second half, there are 7 bullet points, okay? So stay with me. And just in case I forget, and so I don't have to open the screen again, a reminder that next week, Archbishop Andrew Hutchison and Canon Herb O'Driscoll are going to talk about their experience as cathedral deans, parts of the cathedral community, with 2 cathedral redevelopments. And I know you'll be wanting to join in on that. So here we go. I'm going to stop sharing. I tuck my notes here, so I'm not looking down all the time to see what happens. I'm not sure it's going to work. There we are. So first of all, return to last week. We were considering in the final round of questions, what people would conclude about what we thought, if they came into our space and they knew just even a little, what would they conclude about our theology and practice of baptism just by looking around, or our theology of the Eucharist, or of our community, just by where we put things, how big they were, how they were designed, our font, and our lectern, and our pulpit. And when, so I was not part of those discussions, as you know. I have a way of stymieing discussion when I'm in the room, so I tend to stand back. But the facilitators, when we debrief, one of the things that they said was, in one of the groups, people offered this really excellent observation that sometimes how we would perceive things really depends on how we see them used, right? So maybe if people, it's the way we practice baptism, for instance, that would teach us how to think about baptism. And what I wanted to say was, this is a very important observation, and it focuses in on a well-known theological or a liturgical saying, which is this: lex orandi, the law of prayer, lex credendi is the law of belief. So what that means is, not only does our liturgical practice reveal what we believe, so if we degrade our symbols and make them small and insignificant when we're doing a baptism or celebrating the Eucharist, that teaches us to believe that these things are, if you have a baby font, it teaches you to believe that baptism is for infants. It just does. But by the same token, our practice shapes what we believe. So therefore, what we see and what we hear in our Eucharistic prayer, for instance, every week, shapes our belief about, for instance, Eucharistic prayer shapes our belief about what salvation means, that it is a sacrificial blood sacrifice atonement. Now, I no longer resonate very well with that view of the atonement, but it is what the prayer book preaches at me week by week. And if I was never exposed to anything else, what else would I come to believe? So this group has latched onto, and I don't know who you were, but you've latched onto a really important principle, and I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight it for everybody else. The thing I said to the facilitators was, of course, it's true that how we perceive things depends on how we use them. I would love in this cathedral, or in any church I've ever been, if we could just peel one more layer off that onion, and allow what we believe to shape our practice. So that if our view of baptism, the importance of baptism has changed, then maybe we need to do something in our midst that indicates that. And of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that I was showing you with some of those images, right? Where big, new fonts right at the entrance, where it was clear that if you wished, you could immerse someone, you could baptize an adult in them without just sprinkling them with water. Or communities such as the picture of St. Thomas's and St. Catherine's, where people are gathered around the altar for the Eucharist, which shows a kind of developing appreciation that my neighbor, so far from being a distraction to me in worship, is actually the face of Christ. That I am being called to recognize Christ in that person and to be moved by that. Or that the Eucharist, because we're gathered around a table and not just traveling up to it and back, it's a meal. It's not a sacrifice that takes place at some other part of the building. or that the priest who now stands with us around the altar is one of us and not a ruler who is set on high amongst or above the people. So the only point that I just want to make in referring back to last week is that good liturgical change isn't just for the sake of change. It's not a matter of fashion or preference. Good liturgical change is always a matter of trying to eradicate a cognitive disconnect between the things that we believe or that we now believe and what our space, wherever we are, whatever church we're in, will allow us to do. So I just thought I would say those things to see if we could tie last week up with a bow, and to thank you for that really excellent insight that came back from whichever group that was. So now moving on to cathedrals, about which we have quite a bit of experience being members of a cathedral. And as you know, the topic is, how did we get them? Because in case you haven't noticed, most denominations rooted in the Reformation do not have cathedrals, and why it's not just the same as First Met, which is the biggest United Church on the island, right? And it's important for us to think about these things precisely because we are a cathedral. And that being a cathedral lays both some obligations upon us, also some constraints. We don't have some of the liberties that smaller churches, smaller communities have, and also, frankly, some very considerable privileges. So in the chat, let's just sort of check in and think about our own experience for a moment. If you can find the chat, usually it's at the bottom of your screen, and if you just click on it, a little column should come up, and now down at the bottom of that column, you'll see it says to, and that says everyone. Now you can actually write a note to anybody if you click on the little down arrow beside that. But I would like you to, where the cursor is clicking to say type a message, to just list any cathedrals that you have either visited, like you've actually been in and seen them, or attended. They can be anywhere: United States, Canada, Europe, Africa. So you could just take a minute and do that, and let's see where people have been. Got St. Paul's, Christchurch, Montreal, St. Mark's, Seattle, Canterbury, St. Paul's, London, Truro, Durham, is that Audrey? Salisbury, Chicago Temple Cathedral, that's interesting. Ely, Christchurch, Vancouver, St. Mary's, Edinburgh, Edmonton, that's Christchurch Cathedral in Edmonton. They're all Christchurch Cathedral in Canada, almost all of them. Ottawa, St. George's, Kingston. My goodness, we're just filling this up. All right, Exeter, St. George's, Jerusalem, St. John's, Spokane, Cathedral in Portland, Durham, St. Paul's, Kamloops. This is great. All right, so thank you for that. And at the very least, just keep filling them in if you haven't said something, because we're all kind of reading. If you haven't been in another cathedral, you've been in this one, so nobody is unprivileged, all right, in this conversation. I don't see many in the States, a few in Washington State and the Diocese of Olympia, and whatever the diocese is in Oregon. Yes, Maryland, it is. Washington National Cathedral is a little different because it is not a diocesan cathedral. It is a national cathedral for the United States of America, but it is run by the Episcopal Church. There was at one time a movement that St. Paul's on Bloor Street, which was right next to our National Church office, ought to be designated a national cathedral. It was actually the largest church in the Diocese of Toronto, larger than the cathedral even. But that did never happen. Canadians don't have that kind of nationalistic, or let alone Christian nationalistic identity, I don't think. All right, so now here's what I want to, if you just get some ideas of some cathedrals you've been in your mind, especially if you have worshipped there for any length of time. And I'm just interested to find out, and we're not going to do this by chat, we're going to do this by the hands up function, and I'll get Janine to call on you. So Janine, everybody should end up on the front, on the top screen, since Zoom has made this wonderful new change. So do you know how to use the hands up feature? Down at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions. Mine's on the far right of the little icons. And if you click on that, you'll see a place where it says raise hand. And watch what happens when I click on that. Look at me, look at me. See how my hand goes up like that? Thanks, Carol, you've got it. So here's a question for you, and then you can lower your hand just by going into your own little picture, clicking at the top right of your picture where there are 3 little dots, and click on lower hand. And I'm gone now. And if you forget to do that, Janine can lower your hand for you. So here's a question just for us to bat about for a couple of minutes. So last week, while we were valiantly trying to keep you focused on space, thinking about space, this week we get to talk about us and about the ministry that goes on in the space and the mission of those of us who are in the space. And before I begin yammering on at you, the question is, in your experience, very briefly, because we're just kind of brainstorming here. What distinguished the worship, the ministry, the community life of a cathedral that you attended from other churches that you have attended? What was different? And if you have something you'd like to just add to our list, put your hand up and Janine will call on you. And you can shout it out. You have to unmute yourself and shout it out. Want me to read the question again? What distinguishes the worship, ministry, and community life of a cathedral from other churches you have attended?
Martha.
This is easy because I've never actually been part of the worship community of another cathedral. So the only difference that struck me in the various cathedrals I've attended, as opposed to other church, is I would say the feeling of awe. So just usually the building or other aspects of the building is so impressive that it really strikes you. So that's really all I've stuck around to notice at other places.
Thank you.
Sue McRae. So you need to unmute.
Yeah, I come into view also. My impression is that there's more of a sense of the church universal, or certainly the church national at a cathedral. It's less parochial feeling and more outward looking.
Thank you. Anybody else? Come on, it's not Church of the Advent Colwood. Come on, Daniel.
Ian.
Yes, with respect to Christ Church Cathedral here in Houston, where we go sometimes for programs, as well as to St. Martin's Episcopal Church, which is the largest Anglican congregation on the continent, about 9,000 or more members. We noticed the programs are really good at St. Martin's and other Episcopal churches, but the ones at the cathedral don't make the other churches jealous of what they're doing. The cathedral is expected to and gives the feeling of offering programs and worship for the whole diocese.
Great point.
Ian McDonald?
I was at All Saints in Edmonton for quite a long time. And here as well, what I notice is when there are diocesan events, ordination, installation, things like that, that cathedrals have the ability to put on the pomp and circumstance, shall I say, and make it into a very special experience, because there are so many availability of so many different things.
Thank you.
Alan Batten?
Well, most English cathedrals at any rate are not also parish churches, and they don't have a regular congregation.
Thank you. That is something that's going to come up.
And Freeman? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, my experience has been that the cathedrals that I've been associated with had resources that parish churches simply couldn't afford. You know, I think about organs. Of course, being an organist, I think about organs, but also liturgical resources. There are people who are much more adept in producing a meaningful liturgy, because they kind of gravitate to the cathedrals. So I always enjoyed going to the cathedrals, because of course the level of liturgy was usually very high, not in the theological sense, or but just you know, it was very good.
Thank you.
Russ?
Hi, I've attended in Edmonton, Kamloops, and Victoria. And I think the cathedrals have two functions that are very important in terms of the community. One is hosting special events, and also, you know, the really special services, like at Christmas and other times of the year, that just have a role that is somewhat distinct from the local parish church.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ed, Lou,
Ed.
oh, sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, Janine, I'm trying to be good.
Ed?
My on or off. I guess I'm on. My camera's not working, so that's why you don't see me, thank goodness. But anyhow, I've been in most of the cathedrals across Canada. And one of the things that I find different here in Canadian cathedrals as opposed to English and European cathedrals I've been in is that pretty well all the cathedrals in Canada have parish church status.
Yes, that's true. Thank you. All right, I think we're going to move on. Good for you. Oh, Jane, let's not stop Jane from saying something.
There I am. I'm off mute. I would just say that the cathedral sets the standard for the diocese in many, many respects. And of course, my love being setting the standard for musical liturgy as well, for the music. And remembering when our cathedral would be full of people from other churches throughout the diocese who would come in and sing and have hymn sing sessions and choir sessions led by the cathedral staff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's true. So you have really hit a whole lot of the high points of what it is about to follow. So I hope that you will hear yourself and resonate with what follows here. I also made a list here, and I have a couple of things to add. One thing I notice about cathedrals is that they tend to have a large proportion of people who are either visiting or only tenuously attached to the life of the worshiping community. And the other thing is that they tend to have scads of staff or honorary assistants floating around. Somebody mentioned resources, and one of the resources we have is frankly human resources. People, we've got Ed Lewis on this call, Janine, and that's just who I see on my screen here, who are retired clergy. Oh, and I've got Father Martin, retired clergy who bring so much to offer that we could not tap into without their presence. So let's move on. If you're oh, and I also wanted to say, I think Bill Morrison, Audrey Thomas gets second prize, and Bill Morrison gets first prize for the number of cathedrals that they have had a chance to attend. Bill, this must explain why you are able to send me so many pictures, offering more illustrations of things that I have mentioned in this series. Okay, here we go. Oh, up to you if you want to put me on speaker view or just continue as you are and watch other people's reactions, which can also be entertaining. So first of all, what is a cathedral? Pretty simple definition. A cathedral is the center of worship, not just worship, but worship and mission in a diocese. And it's that center which houses the bishop's chair. And that chair is called a cathedra, from which, of course, we get the word cathedral. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which he very rarely does, it means he's sitting in his chair, which was the posture of a teacher, and in Roman Catholic tradition, and that he is speaking with the assurance that he is right. The word for this is infallibility. He doesn't claim that for himself very often, but that's to speak ex cathedra. So the bishop's chair in our cathedral even has a special cushion, and most recently re-embroidered or needle pointed by the Chancel Guild, and the diocesan crest emblazoned on the back of it. And you'll be interested to know that both the bishop's chair and the dean's chair were donated in thanksgiving for the work of AA. I don't know what to make of that, but there it is. All right. Now, for many, it is primarily a place of worship. That's what distinguishes it from, let's say, the Victoria Convention Center. But it also serves, and certainly historically served, as a galvanizing point for local tradition. So, and by that I mean the locality, not just local church tradition, for our sense of civic identity, for the life of the wider community, for our appreciation of heritage and culture, the protection and development of cultural expression, and also of learning. Lots of cathedrals have schools attached to them. And managing these two aspects of community life, so that the locality outside our doors, as it were, the community, and the worship life of of a community, I have to tell you that that is sometimes a real challenge, particularly because, as I just mentioned, most cathedrals, and some others of you have alluded to this as well, most cathedrals have within those who attend or come onto the precinct a subset of people who consider that cathedral to be their worshiping community. That is, they think of it as their parish church, even though a cathedral is not a parish church. But that's how they experience it, and that's how they experience a sense of community there. So this is a delicate negotiation, and we run into challenges all the time. Certainly here we do. For instance, when visitors who may not be churched, not Christian even, not of any religious denomination, but who come in because it looks like a grand building and it would be interesting to poke around. And they don't live up to our expectations for good church behavior. And so, we have to kind of negotiate that. How do we respect those people? Or when we feel the burden of, and even perhaps become a bit resentful of the expectation that we will organize yet another diocesan reception for a bunch of ordinands, none of whom will be serving at the cathedral. We don't know them, and yet there we are slogging it out in the kitchen. And every once in a while, cathedrals get a bit snarky about that. Or when we realize, that as many as 35% of the people who, when we were having an 11 o'clock service, as many as 35% of people who would come to the 11 o'clock service were visitors or tourists. And when the plate went by, they were saving their offering, thank you very much, for their own church in Phoenix, which they assumed needed it more than we do. And we think, like, why are we paying for all of this for you to enjoy? So we can get a little bit snarky because these challenges are not easy to negotiate for, particularly for people who consider themselves part of a cathedral congregation or parish. In New York City, for example, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, they have an interesting arrangement there where the parish community is hived off as a self-contained unit, and they call themselves not St. John the Divine, but St. Saviour's. And so they have a weekly parish Eucharist, and they have other cathedral staff who take care of other cathedral issues. In some ways, we have experimented with something not unlike that in this cathedral. Because you remember when we were having two services, and I lay down my gauntlet once again, get me 150 people on Sunday mornings for a few Sundays in a row, and we can revert to the old pattern. And by the way, there were about 100 on Sunday for those of you who were there, if that gives you any idea where we need to get to. We have sort of experimented with this. We've had a parish Eucharist and a parish choir, and a cathedral Eucharist and a cathedral choir. Now that has been, I would say, more and less successful, and it's partly because there are many people who would attend the so-called cathedral Eucharist who certainly consider themselves to be part of the cathedral community. So it isn't actually a clean distinction in this community. So we really do have to struggle with this tension that I have identified. One of the things I have learned in trying to put some notes together for today is that there has been, for about the last 10 or 15 years, an emerging area of study called Cathedral Studies. part coming out of the fact that the English cathedrals seem to be thriving when everything else is sort of spiraling down. Cathedrals seem to be doing quite well, and so there's a lot of interest in why that is. And maybe if there's time at the end, we could come back to that if anybody is interested in raising it again. But so there are a number within that study. There are a number of metaphors that are being used for cathedrals, and one of them goes right to this point, and it is that cathedrals are sacred space and common ground. So a place where the holy sort of coagulates, if you like, but a ground on which all comers are welcome to come into that sacredness, and to sacralize it with their presence. And we may come back to that again, just as a reminder. Last thing I want to mention, as we're just having a look at this question of what is a cathedral, is it's just an observation, which is that one of the great strengths of cathedrals, ours included, is their ability, or I don't know if it's an ability, but it's just a fact that we tend to attract people who are on the periphery of institutional religion, or for that matter, even of any kind of faith that you might describe as orthodox. But the cathedral seems to be a safe space for them to be. We don't make a lot of demands of them, and because it's big space and there are a lot of visitors, and so we don't expect to know everybody. There's a certain degree of anonymity, which for some people is desirable. They don't want to be accosted by a friendly greeter who says, as happened to a friend of mine at a church in Calgary, which will remain unnamed. It was a church which is kind of on the skids. And this person came up the stairs to the back of the church on Sunday morning, and somebody said, "Oh, you're new. Would you like a box of envelopes?" That's high demand. Sometimes people just need to find their bearings and to decide if this is a place for them. Obviously, this complicates the work of hospitality. Like, who do you lean into, and who do you just let be? We have to have our radar on all the time. So that was point. What is a cathedral? Let's just do a fast dash through history. So, and therefore how we came to have cathedrals. So mostly here we're talking about Anglican cathedrals because that's our concern. But make no mistake, we did not invent cathedrals. Our claim to fame as a church that has roots in the English Reformation is that we actually retained cathedrals. That goes along with our other claim to fame, which is we retained a threefold order of ordained ministry: bishops, priests, and deacons. We don't have like a pastor or a minister. We have three orders of ministry: bishops, priests, and deacons. And we have cathedrals. And you think about it, Lutherans don't have cathedrals. Presbyterians don't have cathedrals. It's just, you don't find it in the Protestant or the non-Roman Catholic anyway, tradition. They may have big churches. We have big churches too, but they're not cathedrals. So alone of the churches which broke with Rome at the time of the Reformation, the Anglican Church kept its cathedrals. So why did that happen? Or how did it happen? So I found an interesting paper by an historian named Christopher is his first name, Hay. And here's what he says, and he's a bit cheeky, but I think he's probably right. He says, well, It's not because anybody decided to have them, but because nobody successfully decided not to have them. In other words, it's an accident of history. Like there was no great master plan, no sort of cheering faction for cathedrals that made sure these got rammed through. It just kind of happened, and very nearly didn't happen. So let me just do a very fast romp for you, because to go into any detail would take a couple of hours, and it would also require somebody with way more historical acumen than I have. So they really did have a very bumpy road from medieval times, and it was in medieval times that some of the great cathedrals were erected, until nearing the end, so the 1660s, so the 17th century, at which point they became a fixture to this day in the Anglican tradition. So their future was finally secured. And as I say, it really just happened. So in medieval England, cathedrals were managed by what was called a group of leaders, clergy, called a chapter. The word chapter comes from the Latin word caput, which means head. So it was a group that headed a cathedral. Now, some of these chapters were overseen by a bishop. And these chapters were known as secular chapters. Now, secular didn't carry any of the pejorative connotation that it does for us today. It just meant that they weren't monastic. And the other group of chapters were monastic chapters. So these were cathedrals that were attached to a monastery, and they were overseen by the abbot of the monastery, of the monastic community. And these monastic cathedrals in particular, they were spacious enough to accommodate elaborate ceremonial, processions and so on. And often because, as you know, monks and sisters say the daily offices, and in those times, 7 of them in a day, like every 3 hours practically, they would build into the space a choir. And now from our previous sessions, a choir was that space with the pews facing each other that the monks could sit to sing and hear each other, because they were singing at each other. And so they would build these, a choir large enough to accommodate all of the monks of the monastery when they gathered to sing their offices. That, of course, will account ultimately for the fact that in cathedrals, it is an expectation to this day that the daily offices will be recited. It's rooted in that very ancient reality. Well, okay, along comes Henry VIII. And we all know Henry had a lot of marital difficulties, but he had military difficulties too. And they were costing him a lot of money, and so was his very extravagant lifestyle. And so he cast about looking for ways to raise money. And he landed on the dissolution of the monasteries. So he could nab all of their assets and pour that into his war efforts and into his extravagant lifestyle. And so these monastic communities became quite impoverished. Now, the cathedrals themselves were reconstituted with what was called a new foundation. But now they were under the thumb, not of their abbot, but they were accountable to Henry. So the bishops kind of did Henry's bidding. And if you know any of your English history, you'll be aware of how interlaced the episcopacy and the king or queens were. So for whatever reason, so that means that the cathedrals continue to survive. The secular cathedrals did anyway. The once monastic cathedrals, now reconstituted, survive. For whatever reason, Elizabeth I, who finally ends up on the throne after all, Henry has exhausted all of his wives and the chance of putting a son on the throne who lives. Elizabeth, for whatever reason, when she finally succeeds to the throne, she keeps them. She keeps the cathedrals along with all of their peculiarities. You know, they were run by deans and they had chapters. Like, their churches have chapters, and they had canons, and they had paid choirs, and they had big staff, and they had everything that you associate with Christ Church Cathedral Victoria. She kept them, and that might have been fine, except that there was obviously we're in a time of Reformation, and not everybody, like, if the Reformation didn't just somebody turned on a switch and everything was reformed. It was a messy business, and there was within the English Church a very strong Puritan faction, and Elizabeth's acceptance of cathedrals with all of the stuff that went with them would have been fine, except for the innovations of somebody we heard about last week and the week before, 2 weeks before, and that was Archbishop William Laud. So he turns up in the early 17th century. And you remember I showed you a picture, you've seen it twice now, of an altar right up against the wall with an elaborate reredos or a screen behind it, and candles and steps up to the altar. And what Laud was doing, and this is important in that image, what he's doing is he's shifting the focus of attention from the pulpit. Remember how the pulpit was in the middle and everybody gathered around the pulpit to hear the sermon? He's shifting attention from the word, sola scriptura, that's the rallying cry of the Reformation, to the altar, which felt just a little too Roman Catholic for some people. He also, and this may have been the last straw, because he sat as a member of the Parliament, he also ensured that senior clergy, bishops, archdeacons, deans, that their power was enshrined in law, and nobody could overturn the decisions that they made. Sort of kind of divine right of deans, bishops, not really, but and that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it led to an outcry by the Puritan party under Oliver Cromwell, who launched the Puritan Revolution. And this ultimately cost Archbishop Laud his head, and England ends up in a period of civil war. And during this period, Parliament passes an act which abolishes the cathedrals and plunders them. Plus ça change. They had to find money to fund their side of the Civil War somewhere, and why not go into the abolished cathedrals, which they said, first of all, they said no Protestant state ought to have such things because they're way too ceremonial, way too much focus on the Eucharist, not enough focus on the word. But besides that, we can't afford them. And so let's shut them down, and then let's go and plunder them. in order to fund our war effort. That's the subtext there, just like Henry. And of course, as you know, in that terrible period, some of the most beautiful, treasured artifacts of the English church were desecrated and destroyed. Statuary was smashed. Stained glass windows were shattered. Altars were burnt. Beautiful wood carvings were lost. And it was a very sad time. And it carried on until the Restoration. Now, I think I forgot to tell you a really important part there, which of course is that King Charles I is, well, it depends whether or not you think he's a martyr. He was certainly murdered. He was executed, and that is how Cromwell took over the sort of the Commonwealth for that about 12-year period of time. Now, eventually, the monarchy is restored in England, and with it, so at this point we almost, see what I mean? We almost lost the cathedrals forever. We almost lost it. But at this point, when the monarchy is restored, the cathedrals are also restored. Now, and it's not that people were pining away after their cathedrals, actually. It's more that there's a slow burning rage over the execution of King Charles. No love lost there. I mean, lots of people hated him and still hated him, but still he was the king. And the execution of a king for many people was just a bridge too far. And so something that Charles would have stood for, the cathedrals, were reinstated. So the bottom line is, according to my informant, Hay, is that the Anglican Church, we have cathedrals, not by hook or by crook, but because it just turned out that way. So let's, how are we doing? Oh, we're doing fine. Let's move along here to, I want you to picture a typical cathedral, all right? That's the next title on the slide. We want to get to these distinctive aspects of cathedral mission and ministry, but first, I think it's important to just kind of have a sense of how cathedrals developed in situ. So you know that the cathedral was often the first church built when new frontiers were being populated by Anglicans. And it was a place, they needed a place to worship. It was a place to worship. In England, many cathedrals are the oldest building in continuous use in their area, like hundreds and hundreds of years. And you see they're situated right at the center of a developing settlement, right at the center of community life. They're going to become the downtown, just as our cathedral is part of the downtown. And for that reason, cathedral ministry, almost without exception, is urban ministry. It is not suburban ministry. It changed. That's a big consideration for us as a cathedral. Many cathedrals, because they were big, and also frequently they had a spire or towers, as we have towers. They were landmarks in their community. They sort of dominated the landscape, and sometimes even, and this would be true here, the seascape. Now, if theologically that domination and those steeples were meant to signify that earth was reaching to heaven, it's like we never learned from the story of the Tower of Babel. Practically speaking, these towers, these steeples, they became a compass, literally a compass for travelers. Tower of St. James Cathedral, some of you have been to St. James in Toronto, is fully 100 feet taller than the Peace Tower in Ottawa. It is visible from Lake Ontario, and it was meant to be visible from Lake Ontario. And it contains a honking great clock at the top of the tower, so that anybody, any mariner on the lake could see the time. And even before it got its bells in its chamber, it rang the hours. So people could hear, as the sound went out over the water, that it was a quarter of the hour, a quarter after the hour, and so on. In many communities, there have been laws or bylaws enacted so that no other building can be built in a way that it obscures a view of the cathedral. Now, that wasn't just because the cathedral was beautiful. It was because the cathedrals had this very important civic function as landmarks. We also have, there are also certain strictures in the city plan of Victoria about our cathedral, although these seem to be dropping like stones these days. As there are many more high rises being built in order to get us to density. All right, so back to our imaginary cathedral. It's big. It's probably the largest, if you're in your little town that you have come to, it's probably the largest public space around. And so it's going to serve not only as a space for worship, but it's going to be a gathering place for the whole community. So that's what I said before, sacred space, common ground. They're going to have living quarters for the clergy. There's going to be a library. This is where the market, where the vendors are going to come and set up market inside. We don't have no pews. They're going to come in and set up their stalls, and they're going to sell fruit and vegetables and dry goods. It's going to be the drinking hall, and it's also going to be the dance floor on Friday nights. It's going to be a place for meetings and for public assemblies, and it's also going to be where legal proceedings take place. Remember that the early basilicas were taken over from the law courts. Remember that when after Constantine and the church was able to go public. So what we need to remember is that parish halls, what are often called education centers, are actually a relatively recent innovation. They didn't exist in the beginning. So not surprisingly, we're going to find that cathedrals are going to be deeply connected, or they should be deeply connected, to the life of their surrounding community. So last section before our break. Cathedrals and parish churches. First, when First Church was the only game in town, that being the cathedral, the bishop would live on the grounds, and the bishop was responsible, functioned like the rector of the parish. And in fact, if I was not here and you did not have a dean, the bishop could make herself the dean of Christ Church Cathedral because of that historic connection. But as towns grew and bishops had greater administrative responsibilities, this is where, in our scenario, chapters came into the mix. And so there would be a little group that was charged with, the bishop remained the chair of the chapter, but a little group that was charged with the administration of the cathedral. This is why we have a chapter room, right? That's where the name comes from. Now, of course, as the town grew, and people don't have cars, they can't just get in their little Honda Civic and zip down the peninsula. People want a place to worship in their own community. And so we have this phenomenon where the cathedral would establish a daughter church somewhere else. So for instance, St. Matthias is a daughter church of Christ Church Cathedral. And and those in the beginning, those daughter churches were considered missions of the cathedral until they became self-sustaining. And for this reason, cathedrals often came to be referred to as the mother church of their diocese. We are running a little short on time, and so I won't go into my comments about why that might be a problematic way to refer to the cathedral these days, but there are debates about this. I will say that there's never a time when we aren't acting a bit like a mother in this diocese by sharing resources. Our honorary clergy, there's almost never a time when one of our honoraries is not serving as an interim priest in a parish which does not have an incumbent. There we are. Here's where we have been. I hope you feel like that's where we were. And here's where we're going. So distinctive aspects of cathedral mission and ministry. Things, I mean, all churches have things that we share in common, but there are distinctives for us. That's the point here. So now I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you. So the first thing I'd like to identify is this this tension that we live with all the time between being guardians of a tradition that has been entrusted to us and leaders in change. So that's that. Should the church be the vanguard or the rear guard, the flagship or you know, something else, the caboose? Sorry, that's a mixed metaphor, but there you go. So, and we're called to negotiate this fine balance, and it actually matters, because without sounding too self-absorbed, the truth is people are watching us. We're the cathedral, whether we like it or not. We are exemplars. That is a role which has been thrust upon us. I don't know if it was Russ, maybe somebody talked about setting a standard. And sometimes cathedrals err in one direction or the other. So they can be the flavor of the month on the one hand, or they can be absolutely entrenched on the other. But so in our desire to protect traditions, cathedrals, we can get a bit fusty, like there's no air circulating in this place, and fussy, very precious about our ceremonial. We can misunderstand what tradition means. We can mistake tradition for what we're used to. And we can focus our energies on things that really have nothing to do with the gospel, like prayers. We just have to hear this prayer because we know and like it, even though its theology may be questionable, or because it uses Elizabethan English and I think it sounds nice. Or the use of little bits of ceremonial that have long since ceased to mean anything to anybody, but those who know the secret handshakes. Why do they drop a little piece of bread in the chalice just before communion? I don't blame you if you don't know that. And we stopped doing it because nobody knows what it means anymore. On the other hand, there are within our tradition crown jewels. And we have an obligation to protect those, to keep them buffed up, and to pass them as a living tradition on to those who follow us. And this might be something like the whole idea of common prayer. That is not a book of common prayer, but the prayer can be done in common, that everybody has access to the words, that everybody is able to participate fully, and that we pray with one voice to God. We are not an aggregate of individuals praying to God, but we are one common voice. That I would say is a crown jewel for Anglicanism. There are others. But now if we go over to the change side of the equation, as I have said, cathedrals, they're more likely to err on the side of entrenchment, actually, than they are of getting trendy, frankly. We carry, as I've said, considerable clout in the imagination of the wider church. And I have certainly experienced times when a cathedral has failed me as a parish priest. I can remember in the Diocese of Toronto, this would be now almost 40 years ago, when we first had the VAS and nobody was buying it, right? It was the spinach book. There was great resistance all around, and yet the clergy were charged with introducing it and helping people to understand how it came to be and how to use it. It did not help, I can tell you. Jody, that is enough. It did not help to go to a diocesan synod at St. James Cathedral, which was kind of in your face, Book of Common Prayer, not even reordered. Lord's Prayer still after you had your daily bread instead of before, all that stuff. Every rubric attended to with minute attention. You know what happens when people go home from synod to their parish priest? They say, well, the cathedral, please God, that any parish in this diocese should use our example as a weapon in their own parishes against change. That would be bad. Excuse me. You may not be bothered by the ambient noise, but my dog is. I will say that I feel that we have been doing our job here. When I attend a local church in this diocese, and I see that they have a practice that I know they first saw here, that makes me feel good. I'll give you one example of a local parish who now varies their response to the readings, and in particular, Word of God, Word of Life. I look at it like this. Do you remember the famous images? Oh dear, I hope we're not going there, just a minute. Do you remember the famous images of Princess Diana when she visited an AIDS hospice in Toronto in the early years of that plague? All the fears and prejudices that were swirling around, and people were afraid of people who had AIDS. And there she was sitting at the bedside of this young man. She took her white gloves off. She reached out, she grabbed his hand, and she held it. I cannot tell you the difference that made. All across the world, not just at Casey House. Cathedrals, in our liturgy, but also in the causes that we espouse and stand up for, we are called to be like that. Then we're doing our job. So that's the tension between guardians of tradition and leaders of change. We're also, as we have noted, the diocesan church. For the diocese, it's the bishop's church. It's going to be the normal location of celebrations for the diocese: ordinations, confirmations, synods, conferences, regional gatherings. Now, I hope I don't need to point out that this cathedral is uniquely unsuited to almost all of those things, with the exception, of course, of worship. And we also have a responsibility as, can I just call this the diocesan church rather than the mother church, to foster relationships with the other parishes in the diocese and to share our resources with them. Because notwithstanding the fact that we run a deficit, we are unbelievably wealthy by comparison with parishes that can't even afford a part-time priest. And who certainly couldn't afford to mount some of the kinds of programs that we can mount. And I've already mentioned in this regard that we share our honoraries who are just wonderful about assisting parishes that need clergy supply. Our live streaming has, do you know that? I wonder if you know that because of our live streaming capacity, some of our smaller parishes where it's just so hard for them to pull all this stuff off every single week during COVID, have been able to say, folks, next week we're joining the cathedral. That we are able to do some of the heavy lifting for parishes who are not as richly resourced as we are. Ross has been inviting guest preachers to Evensong and inviting them to bring members of their congregation with them. It's actually, believe it or not, it's an honor to be asked to preach at the cathedral. And so this is a gift that we can give, especially to junior clergy who are just, I mean, they're in awe of the space when they come in. So that's part of what it is to be for a cathedral church to be a church for its diocese. The third thing on that list of 7 was worship. No surprise here. I'm going to say that worship is the heartbeat of cathedral life. It's regular, it's steady, it is ongoing, day by day by day by day, lub-dub, 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 just like the heart. I mentioned earlier the importance of the monasteries in teaching us to embed daily prayer into a cathedral's life. These days, really just morning and evening prayer. That is an expectation of all clergy, that they will say the office daily, but only of cathedrals is it expected that the office will be prayed in public. And if you read the rubrics in your prayer book, it says, the people may be out in the fields by 8:30 in the morning or whatever it is. But so you should at least ring the bell so that they can lift their hearts to God and know that someone is at prayer. There are other things about worship in a cathedral, and partly this has to do with the fact that we must devise our liturgies in big space. Like no matter how much you love your favorite hymn, if it isn't long enough to get the choir from the back to the front, you're never going to hear it as the opening or the closing hymn. You're never going to hear it at the offertory if we don't have time to take up the offering during the length of that hymn. So everything has to be writ large in big space, big voices, big gesture, big furniture, big symbols. Why we insist, excuse me, on a tiny little priest's host. It's like 3 inches across, maybe. I don't know how you can see that from the back of the cathedral. Why don't we actually have bread that looks like bread? Big symbols. And big instruments. You can't use a guitar in a cathedral. The sound decays before it gets to the 5th pew. So these are some limitations. They're limitations. They're things that we have to think of things that work up the road at St. John's or at St. George's Cathedral Day or any place you might name, they won't work in our space. And that's just something as members of a cathedral congregation we have to deal with. More than this, going back to the fact that we're a landmark, a tourist attraction even, people, when they come to us, they have certain expectations of what they're going to find. They're looking for a dignified service that is well-crafted and full. Now, it's not to say rigid, it's not to say cold or inaccessible, but it does mean that there needs to be, in big space, a certain formality. Folksy, aw, shucks, all in the family liturgies, those work when the gathered community actually is all in the family, but they don't work in a cathedral. In a cathedral, all that kind of worship does is serve to remind the visitor that they're an outsider here. They're not part of the family. So this is the fact that we have all of these visitors also lays some constraints upon us that we need to consider. And then beyond this, of course, there's an expectation, I think, on the part of anybody who attends a cathedral, that the liturgy is going to be done well, that the clergy know what they're doing. They're not going to go in the wrong direction around the altar. It's a kind of things that people, church nerds, kind of people that go and visit cathedrals, they tend to know stuff. Did you know that she crossed her hand with her left? She made the cross with her left hand. Or did you notice the procession went in the wrong direction? The clergy need to know what they're doing, or they're just going to get under the skin of people that we don't really need to offend. There's no need to offend them if we are careful. Choirs need to be able to sing. They need to be singing music that they can manage to sing well. Doesn't have to be the most complex music, just has to be music where people are not going to be holding their breath, hoping that they all get to the double bar line at the same time. Servers need to serve, as scripture says, in readiness and decency. And just one last thing about worship, and this ties back to what I was saying earlier about cathedrals and change, is it's also the case that cathedrals are often given latitude by their bishop to try new things on behalf of the whole church. So when things are in the test phase. And in fact, I think a cathedral should be the first church that a bishop could turn to say, do you all be willing to just test this new liturgy for 6 months and let us know where it needs to be fixed? We are doing a bit of that, I might say, at morning prayer, or at least we were. The materials we were testing have now been adopted by the church as an alternative to the alternative in the book of alternative services. All right, now it's 5:30, and if people need to scoot, you just go, okay? Fourth thing on that list was program, discourse, education. I've already mentioned, we have the size to accommodate at least some people, not large gatherings, unfortunately, if you want people interacting with each other. But cathedrals, because of their size and because of their natural connection to the world around them, they have the capacity, and I think they have the responsibility to engage in meaningful public discourse, to be an intersection between faith and gospel concerns, and intellect. We need to use whatever influence or reputation we have, because we're the cathedral, to invite knowledgeable speakers who they're not otherwise available to smaller churches, partly because smaller churches can't afford them, partly because speakers like to know that they're going to have a bit of a megaphone if they have something to say. And they've got a bigger megaphone in a building that houses a larger number of people. So, and I think that this is more and more important. I don't know if there's ever been a time in my life where it was more important for the church to have something to say, a word for public consumption. Perhaps at the moment, a word about how there's no such thing as freedom without responsibility. Thinking of the current vaccine debates. And the more the church becomes marginalized, the more difficult it is to broker this kind of conversation. There are so many people with such wisdom to offer, but they either have no history of association with an institution of faith, or they've resolutely distanced themselves from faith or the institutional church. I mean, but the bottom line is that they are suspicious of our invitations. A couple of years ago, I invited one of our chiefs of police to come to a service and read the story of the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem. And we were using that story as a way of showing, it was around Christmas time. We were using that story as a way of showing that Christ comes to us as Savior insofar as he comes to undo violence. It seemed like a no-brainer to me that if the police are about trying to keep people safe from violence, that this would be a natural person to read this reading. And the response was that he didn't feel that he could be associated with a religious reading. So it's hard work, but my friends, we have to get back in the game here. We need to use what podium we have. Science may think it's queen, and maybe it is queen, but I'm telling you, if that's the case, this queen has not actually brought us to a very good place, to a very good land. And science needs to be held accountable. At least there needs to be a dialogue, a respectful dialogue. So, and in that regard, I think it is more important than ever that our preaching and our teaching and the people that we invite in offer us intellectually rigorous and sound words, so that we can be seen as engaging all of these issues before us as a society responsibly and thoughtfully. That's 4. 5, art and architecture. The first thing is that cathedrals themselves are a piece of art. And because they have, because they've been built over centuries, and they're expensive, they represent a major artistic investment in their city, wherever they are. This is a point never to be forgotten in negotiating with municipal authorities for considerations. City of Victoria should want, here we go. There goes the first one. Depending on how bad it is, there'll be 3. Okay, we're good. That our municipal authorities in Victoria should want this cathedral to be in this place, right? Because it is a treasure. But besides the architecture itself, which may be significant. The church houses treasures. So let's just to the question of the architecture itself, I want to tell you a story about the Cathedral of, again, Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. Their masonry was crumbling. This is some years ago now. And there was no one in the United States who any longer had that craft under their hand. And their response to this, so that means cathedrals can help to revive ancient crafts. Their response to this, and here's a cathedral engaging with its neighborhood, right? The response was to go into Harlem and to find young men who would be willing to be paid to go to Europe and learn stonemasonry, to apprentice as stonemasons, and then to come back to New York and do the work that needed done. Now, that strikes me as a brilliant solution. And similarly, when I get on to the treasures that we have, stained glass is a treasure. There are not many people who have any longer the expertise of our stained glass curator, Ed Schaefer, whom we retain even though he now lives on the East Coast. Just the gift of beauty and grandeur. You come into a space and people it's breathtaking. Their spirit is awakened. This is the art of architecture. Paintings. Now, we don't have many paintings in our cathedral, but certainly in Europe, you'll find paintings all over the place. Remember being in Rome for a week and visiting lots of churches, and at a certain point, I think to myself, gosh, all I've been doing is visiting churches. Maybe I should get myself to an art gallery. Where are the art galleries? The churches are the art galleries, right? I mean, with the exception of the Vatican, the churches are the art galleries. Sculpture, not so much in Anglican churches, but certainly in Roman Catholic churches and cathedrals. The foot of St. Peter in St. Peter's, which has been kissed so many times that it's burnished. It's quite amazing, moving, in fact. The textile arts. Cathedrals who have maintained vestments, for instance, and altar hangings sometimes have some very beautiful old textiles, fabric art. And there's sometimes some very new, we have two new, quite stunning pieces, both by Carol Sabiston. One is the four green panels hanging behind the high altar, which are studded with jewels and bits of fabric which were recovered from vestments which were being retired. So it kind of has that historical look. The other is the purple/pinky red frontal that she did. Those of you who know Christchurch Cathedral in Vancouver will know that for many years, Thomas Roach has been their textile artist in residence. And they've done some amazing work as a community, both in the creation of vestments and banners and fabric displays. Similarly, space for exhibits. We have done some of this, not as much as I hope we can. But you remember Patricia Vickers' quite amazing exhibit up in the CNJ in the last couple of years, talking about Indigenous abuse, and Ted Harrison, the Ted Harrison exhibit that we had up there as well. So we can do more of that, but this is typical use of cathedral space because we have the space and we are public space, common ground. maybe the last thing I might like to say about that, how are we doing? We're almost there, is that while of course we don't want to be thought of as a museum, because it takes so long for cathedrals to be built and because they're never finished, they do sometimes manage to preserve and tell the story of a community. Like if you know how to read it, Gordon Wheatley knows how to read what I call military corner in the cathedral. It's the back corner with the flags and the Pemberton cross and so on. He can tell you what that tells us about our history and the history of Victoria. Our stained glass windows, if you look up at the ones at the top that represent fishing, industry, mining, law, architecture, they tell you what people were engaged with when those windows were created, what Victoria economy was like, and so on. Number 6 was going to be music. I don't think I need to convince anybody of the importance of music, or the fact that we, you know this, right? That if you want to hear good choral music, you go to an Anglican church, because Anglicans have almost single-handedly preserved the English choral tradition. I'm grateful that tradition is, it's quite a colonial tradition. I'm grateful that tradition is being expanded, and certainly under our current leadership, we're doing a bit more in that way. But that is a jewel that we are sustaining for posterity, and no more than in training up young singers, because people don't sing anymore. The only place you sing these days, they don't even sing Old Canada at a hockey game. The only place you sing is in church. I won't say anything more about that because I think we all know it. Which brings me to the last one. You'll be so glad. And that is civic engagement, or social justice. When I've said the cathedral is the bishop's church. When a bishop is ordained or consecrated bishop, at the end of the service, in this case, Anna, she went to the back of the church and we opened the doors out onto the city, and she faced outdoors and she pronounced a blessing called Urbi et Orbi, which means a blessing to the city, Urbi, and to the world, Orbi. Our doors open out. Our concern is for what's outside our doors. All the people who aren't inside, these are the people God has commended into our care. So, and I tried to show that there is this natural connection just because of where cathedrals are planted and how they were originally used between a cathedral and its in our case, city. And because of that, cathedrals have often had a strong concern for social justice, partly because those mostly in need tend to congregate in the downtown core. I'm sure you noticed that. And so it's not just a matter of offering a venue for royal occasions, which we certainly do, or for police funerals, which we certainly do and are expected to do and should do. National celebrations or tragedies are marked here. We have some bell ringers here. The bells in a cathedral tower are used to announce war and peace, tragedy, joy. That has been, that has been their role. Before the factory had a whistle that blew at noon, you knew it was noon because the church bell rang. So it's understood that in the face of tragedy, we will provide a place for vigil. I think most of you were here a couple of years ago when dear little girls, Aubrey and Chloe, were murdered on Christmas Day. This is the place their parents came immediately afterwards to congregate and hold each other. This was the place they came morning after morning after morning after dropping their children off to come in where they could receive counsel if they needed, or just hold each other and cry out of the earshot of their children. That is our role. That is our role. On 9/11, when most people were glued to their television screens, cathedrals were offering prayers on the hour, every hour. We're the ones who need to step up to those occasions. So I have to say something nice about St. James Cathedral, because I said something mean about them before. It's why they have an addictions counselor on staff, and they run a literacy program for inner city children. It's why St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town was where anti-apartheid workers could gather safely. It's why Grace Cathedral in San Francisco became a safe place for the gay community who were living with AIDS and all kinds of violence and hostility in the late 80s and early 90s. It's why Coventry, our Coventry with whom we are affiliated, has this ministry of reconciliation after the bombing of their cathedral in the Second War. And last comment, it's why we pray that God will give us grace to grow into our own aspiration to be a cathedral for the city.